All right. Well, hello, Karen.
Hi.
I am so happy to be joined today by Karen King, and I'm really excited to have a conversation about your experiences in the counseling field and in the in the sort of, I guess, socio-political circumstances we're finding ourselves in right now. And so would you mind just starting off with a little introduction for yourself? Tell a little bit
Yeah,
about you.
sure. I'm a counselor of 17 years. I own a business, a counseling and psychiatry business in Washington State. I'm also a trained MAP certified, so that's Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies, certified MDMA assisted therapist, as well as a psychedelic assisted therapist trainee through MAPS. So my focus is really ketamine assisted psychotherapy and eventually MDMA and psilocybin and LSD when those are FDA approved.
Well, it's really fascinating. It's such a new, sort of newly embraced branch of the therapy field, newly legitimized, I guess,
Yeah,
and people are learning that there's so much potential there.
yeah, yeah. I mean, and it really does intersect, to use a phrase, nicely with everything that's happening with CSJ, CRT, woke culture. And that's one of the things I really wanted to have the opportunity to talk to you about, but also your listeners, because I haven't heard a lot of people talk about or even embody a heterodox idea within psychedelic studies. So far, what I've come up against in my trainings is a lot of woke ideology.
Mhm.
And that's really what I'm interested in learning more about by talking about this with you and others. Gosh, I would love to interview other psychedelic counselors to see if they're going through this. But I have experienced the pain of CRT and CSJ in my business, in my practice, and in my training, and it just feels like it's every day. I'm actually
Mhm.
dealing with something that is a direct result of wokeness.
Wow, that's interesting to me because it's sort of, I guess, it almost counterintuitive to me that
Mm,
this area it would be so rife with this, but at the same time, maybe it's both our new kind of it's new, it's something that's broken off from this original conventional therapy model that we've so
mhm.
I don't know, maybe I should back up a little bit though and ask you,
Yeah,
what kind of brought you to where you are with this, to where you're ready to talk about this publicly,
yeah.
and what's been your arc in terms of experiencing the incursion of CSJ into the counseling?
Hmm. I feel like I could write a novel. It's I've been so steeped in it. The arc is that I wasn't aware of any of this until 2019. And in 2019, I started noticing something odd was happening with my employees. So actually my admin staff. And then in 2020, I noticed more of that with my clinical staff. And then in 2021, after George Floyd's murder, um, things just became exponential. And then as a result of that, I had the experience of really being at the end of a lot of projection from my clinical employees and my admin staff, and it created a whole messy breakdown of the culture that we had worked so hard to create.
Mhm.
Um, so we started our business in 2015. We're a counseling and psychiatry practice. We had 20 counselors, 4 psychiatric nurse practitioners. We built up.
Oh, that's a big practice.
Yeah, it was. It really was.
Yeah.
Um, and in 2019, the first thing I noticed was I had a receptionist, and they revealed they had a lot of mental health issues. This usually is what happens when you run a counseling practice. Um, People at all the levels of employment will tell you their issues, especially if you're a counselor running the practice. And so I learned that this person had a very intense history, um, and that they had revealed they were going to counseling, and they identified as I think they identified as he, him, but were natally a female, if I remember correctly. Or it was either they, them, or he, him.
Okay.
And so, that was great. I was still really trying to be a nice liberal.
Was
And
that really one of your first exposures to somebody making those kind of requests with
yes,
pronouns?
yeah,
Okay.
it
Okay.
was. Yeah, 2019.
Mm, mhm,
And it felt harmless. It felt innocuous. Like, of course, like I've heard so many people say, so many intelligent people say on so many podcasts, we're liberals. We just want to be nice to people. We want everyone to feel good. And
mhm,
especially as a therapist,
mhm,
I want to respect someone's reality. So
mhm, mhm,
that was fine.
mhm.
But the thing that happened, and the reason I even mentioned pronouns is that I guess it was just 3 months later, this person didn't show up to work. And we called and we said, "Are you okay?" And their therapist came into our clinic. So this is my admin staff. Their therapist came into our clinic and accosted our manager and said, "You made my client try to kill themselves."
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And
That raises so many
I
questions.
know, I know, I know. But I really think it is a perfect embodiment of the complete misunderstanding of CSJ, CRT, and victimhood culture. Because here was this therapist who obviously had over enmeshed with their client
Mhm, mhm,
and was seeing themselves as the advocate for their
mhm,
client.
mhm,
And this is proof of the damage it can do. So instead of a therapist advocating with their client saying,
mhm,
"Hey, how can you advocate for yourself and get a better schedule?" Or
mhm, mhm,
empowering the individual, that didn't happen. And it was so shocking to me as a
mhm.
therapist
That
to
level of
imagine
caretaking.
what kind of mental
Mhm,
state would that therapist have to be in to actually go to an employer and accuse them. And the fact that we're a counseling practice, it was
mhm.
it was quite surreal.
Yeah.
Yes, that was my first introduction to something seems off.
Was there anything relevant about the accusation itself? Or was that just something interpersonal between those 2 people?
Really don't know. I mean, it
Okay.
was a receptionist job and
Mhm.
they answered the phones. So,
Yeah.
it wasn't like they were doing crisis work or,
Yeah. So it's just this
triggered.
bizarre thing where this
Yeah,
therapist comes in
yeah,
and causes a conflict over
yeah,
something that's going on with their client.
yeah,
Yeah.
very, which is odd enough. And
Mhm.
and incidentally, I believe this therapist has they them pronouns and specializes in working with trans and
Mm.
non-binary. Which
Okay.
I do think is relevant because I think there's a philosophical stance that goes along with that we see playing out in so many different areas. But this was my first
Mhm.
direct contact with it. Um, yeah, and then the next year, I guess the pandemic happened. It's all a blur, and we hired. Uh, was it 2020 that George Floyd happened, or was it
It
2021?
was 2020.
You're right, it was
Mhm. Mhm.
2020. Okay,
Mhm.
so the next
Hard to keep it all straight these
it
days.
is, yeah.
Yeah.
So the next incident was I hired a psychiatric nurse practitioner who was a student of ours, and she was great, and we're really happy to have her. And she accused me of being racist, and she's African American.
Okay.
And before she even started, we were talking about, okay, what clients do you want to work with? What's your schedule? And I said, how about you run a mental health group? And you can talk about like the feelings that have come up for people in the George Floyd situation and
Mhm.
talk about how it might exacerbate their depression or anxiety. And she said, no, I don't have a curriculum for that. And I said, oh, well, you don't necessarily need a curriculum. It can be something informal like a process group.
Mhm.
And,
Mhm.
she's a new ARNP, PMNHP, so psychiatric mental health provider,
Okay.
excited to start and do new things. And so I was
Mhm.
offering this to her. And then she became very upset and said, you are using your white privilege to bully me with your authority into doing something that I'm not comfortable doing. And I was stunned, like, what? And so we had a conversation about it. And I said, my perception is just that I am saying to you, hey, will you run this group? And it's my job to support you in that, and maybe even help you navigate your edges as a new practitioner. I can be there to support you. And she said I was using my white privilege. And that was the first time I had heard that
Wow.
in my professional world. And
And
later,
it's such a strong accusation to make
yeah,
against one's employer. I mean,
oh,
those
yeah,
are really strong words.
it was terrifying. And yeah, at that time, I was taken in by all of the cultural zeitgeist, and I was reading White Fragility, and I was dismantling my internal racism skeptically because I know my own experience and growing up in the Deep South and advocating, like actually dealing with family members that have racist beliefs, and as a teen, talking with them about it and negotiating that and never agreeing with them. And it was just so shocking because I had never seen myself that way. And I am not a racist. So she apologized. She did apologize a few weeks later, and she said, "I'm sorry, I was really caught up in what was happening." So I'm grateful for that. But then I started a PhD program at California Institute of Integral Studies. And I started it in order to get my PhD in consciousness. At that point, it looked like the FDA was going to approve the use of MDMA for people who could facilitate with a terminal degree. So basically a PhD had to be in the room. So I was like, okay, I'm doing that. And that is based in San Francisco. And it was an online program. And that is my true introduction to wokeism, CSJ, CRT. And I was taught about pronouns. So I'm new to this. I guess I'm realizing a lot of people have had a earlier experience. Yeah, so I remember the first argument I got into with my somatics professor, who told me, she introduced herself and said she, her, gender queer, blah, blah, blah. Some other pronoun things I don't remember. And I told her I didn't want to know. I said, why would you think I would want to know who you have sex with? I just
Wow.
met you.
Yeah.
And I think I sort of stunned her because, there she is in San Francisco and she's doing this. And I had never been exposed to this. So what I was asking, I thought was really logical. Like, why do you think I care? And my argument with her was, if 3 out of 5 women have been sexually assaulted before the age of 18, which are the stats, right? Then that means a whole lot of people with PTSD in our culture, and probably pretty unresolved. Why would you ever want to have sex enter an intellectual conversation within the first 5 minutes of knowing someone? How is that safe?
That's a good argument.
I've never heard anyone talk about this, but I think if, of course, there's not a lot of logic to this ideology.
Well,
So
that's a good argument because it enters the same realm of safetyism that we see that's part of this whole picture. And so you're kind of using their own logic to say, and that it goes kind of in line with another argument that I've heard around pronouns, which is don't force people to give their pronouns, because there might be people who are trans who don't want to come out yet, and you're forcing them to out themselves. And so it's it feels almost like a martial arts move, kind of using their own momentum against them.
My Aikido training.
Yeah, that's right.
What's interesting, Leslie, is that I've been reflecting on this a lot, is that I actually graduated from a social constructionist grad program.
Wow.
So Our Lady of the Lake in San Antonio.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I'm from San Antonio.
I know.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah.
Wow. Our Lady of the Lake. How funny. Yeah. I went to St. Mary's.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So I went to the Houston satellite program. And so it was narrative, collaborative language systems, and solution-focused brief treatment.
Okay.
And so I didn't learn CBT. I barely learned diagnosis, but we were steeped in social constructionism. And so it's so interesting now, 17 years later, to be looking at what seems like a very dangerous progression of what that concept philosophically was. I could totally get behind it as a grad student, like, oh, everyone's subjective reality is their own. Well, that makes sense. everyone has their own experiences. They have see the world through that filter. Okay, well, that makes sense. And then moving along in time to our culture now, it doesn't mean that your reality then is my reality. And that's the danger, is that there has to be some agreed upon reality like gravity,
Yeah.
time.
Some basis for understanding,
Yeah.
foundations.
Yeah. I mean, it's been taken to an extreme, but
And do you think when you look back on that early training, do you think that what we're seeing now is a logical progression and it had to be and it would have necessarily ended up where it was? Or do you think that there's a point at which you could put a pin in it and say, okay, now this was reasonable,
yeah.
but we've gone too far? And where is that point?
Mm. Yeah, that's an interesting question. I feel like I'd have to have a lot of like historical, geopolitical, cultural information.
Mhm,
But what comes to mind is the premise of narrative therapy,
mhm,
and how in Australia, Michael White created narrative therapy. I think it was in the early 80s, mid 80s. And his whole theory was to bring the non-dominant discourse to the forefront, so much like intersectionality and recentering the minority. He was trying to do that psychologically, and he did that through studying the Aboriginal storytelling. And so I think about that and how it aligns nicely with centering and recentering. And he was really into almost like a parts system of creating identities from those minority parts, like depression with a capital D. What does depression do to you?
mhm,
And
yeah.
almost, like
So
animating.
like sort of externalizing
Yeah,
aspects of the
yeah.
issue.
Which is kind of what we've done now. I mean, if you believe that there is a spirit that floats around and lands in your body and tells you if you're male or female,
Mhm,
it's or one day and not the other day or something else. It's
mhm.
almost as mythological, actually.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think also it seems like, and I don't know if this is, it made sense in my head. So let's see if it makes sense out
Okay.
loud. But like even cognitive behavioral therapy is a similar sort of thing because it's letting you know that depending on what story you're telling yourself,
Mm,
you're going to see the world very differently because
yeah.
here's this way you're seeing it, but maybe that's a distortion and maybe here's another. And so
Mhm,
even, and that's the most sort of mechanical theory
mhm,
that I know anyway
yeah.
of the mind right now that's prevalent.
Yeah, and also what CBT takes as its a priori assumption is that there is an objective reality to observe in a particular way.
Mhm,
You know,
mhm,
like
mhm.
I was listening to your live stream this morning about Satanism,
Yeah.
and I was, and that reminds me. Okay, I have a note over here because I wanted to remember to tell you this. Did you read the Colette article about astrobiology and how it's being decolonized?
No, no, I have not read
You,
that. That sounds
I,
very interesting.
I think you would love this. It's just like Satanism. So
Okay.
I can't even believe I'm about to say this. So they have actually decided amongst themselves as very woke astrobiologists that they are changing the search for extraterrestrial intelligence to be something else because intelligence is a
Oh
white
no, that's an offensive word now. Oh no.
intelligence is a white, oh, what is the word? Construction.
Oh gosh.
So I mean, if you think about that, the implications of that, intelligence is a white
I
construction.
can't imagine something that's more offensive
Yeah,
to human beings in
yeah,
general.
I know.
Like,
I feel like, do they even hear what they're saying?
that sounds so white supremacist
I
to
know,
me.
I know. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, I know. I mean, I understand in the context of like hierarchy and progressivism and moving through time in a particular way is this supposedly white Western concept.
Mhm.
Um, so I can hear like my early 90s education, very liberal education informing me, but the indigenous peoples maybe experience time as circular and they don't have
Mhm.
past
Mhm.
tense. So I
Mhm.
see the argument, but I also see the real world implications in calling intelligence white, which is
Yes.
horrific.
Yes.
And
It's
so what are they going to call it? The search for extraterrestrial people of color? I mean, I don't, what is the tip? What are they going to say?
Just life in general, I guess, maybe. And then I
Yeah.
wonder if that'll end up being an offensive thing at some point.
Yeah.
Life.
Lifeism.
Yeah, exactly. So, and while we're down this trail, because I feel
Yeah.
like we've gone down a little bit of a
Yeah.
rabbit trail of tangents, and I want to pull you back
Yeah.
to the story about where you were with your education and how
Yeah.
this was coming up.
Yeah.
But while we're on this, I just want to say that makes me think of this whole concept of decolonization. I think you just mentioned that they were decolonizing something.
Yeah.
We're colonizing everything with CSJ. Everything is
Yeah.
being colonized with
Yeah.
this new way of thinking.
Yeah.
It is the most colonial,
Yeah.
the most overtly supplanting
Yeah.
ideology I've ever witnessed. So there's just
Yeah.
so much irony in that.
There's so much paradox, and that's what
Mhm.
makes it so confusing as an
Mhm.
ideology, is they're so consciously or unconsciously skillful at using language and subversive concepts. Like, because what they would be saying, I think, is that they are liberating our limited perceptions into acceptance of everything,
Mhm. Mhm.
flattening everything out, basically.
Mhm.
So, yeah,
Yeah, it's fascinating. It's
it is
bizarre
fascinating.
and weird,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
fascinating.
And here we are, and it's horrifying at the same time. So I
Yeah.
I was in my PhD program,
Mhm.
and it was really, I had that conversation, and I struggled through that class, because it was all about our identities, and of
Mhm.
course, really confirming our
This was the
identities.
somatic therapies
Yeah,
class. Yeah.
yeah, for
Mhm.
somatic therapy.
Mhm.
Um, and then I entered the psychedelic training. So that was 2022, the Naropa psychedelic assisted therapy training. And this is where I feel a little nervous talking. I notice, like, there's a lot of certification that hasn't happened yet. There are boards getting together, and they are writing these codes of ethics that say that, much like you had to sign or were asked to sign, I will have to make a pledge to, above all things, decolonize psychedelic medicine,
Mm. Mm.
um, and look at my own white supremacy and dismantle systemic racism. And
Wow.
I've seen some of the proposed language through some of the professional organizations, which is where I got really fearful for this field. So to go back, I went to a week retreat, and then it's online training, meeting monthly. And then we
Mhm.
had another couple of retreats. But that first retreat, my assumption is that we would be learning uh, different concepts of consciousness,
Mhm.
clinical skills to interact with someone in an altered state. And literally, for 5 days of that training, we learned about power,
Mhm.
right use of power, and white supremacy, and dismantling our internal racism. And I was so disappointed.
Wow. It seems like you could have been learning such valuable skills to take to your
Yeah,
work and that
yeah,
you need
yeah,
because that's
yeah,
a really sensitive position to be in with somebody.
yeah,
And instead it was a DEI training.
yeah. And it was so surprising to me. Maybe I shouldn't have been surprised, because Naropa was created by Shambhala, which has huge, I mean, it's a cult. And I was part of Shambhala, and I would say I was definitely a cult member.
Wow. I don't know anything about this. This is
Oh,
really
really?
interesting.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. This is a whole separate conversation, but um, so Shambhala is a certain form of secularized Tibetan Buddhism,
Okay.
led by a Tibetan monk who came over in the 80s. And Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche founded Naropa.
Okay.
And Naropa is this Buddhist college that I went to in my undergrad, and then ended up doing this training through MAPS because it's a contemplative approach, I thought. And that is the approach that's being studied and utilized to the best results in psychedelic medicine, is having
Mhm.
this meditation practice and a contemplative approach.
Okay.
However, so great aspirations of Buddhist college, a very flawed spiritual teacher who slept with his students and blah, blah, blah.
Mhm. Mhm.
And then also his son inherited the lineage slept with students, abused his power.
Oh
And that came
gosh.
out, I think that was 2018.
Mm.
So I think Naropa maybe overcompensated and went way to the woke and the use of power, although
Mhm.
maybe they were always headed there. But
So it was a vulnerable organization at that point, and
yeah,
that's where they went.
yeah, yeah.
Okay.
I think the DEI initiative and everything fit nicely with what the wounds that they were trying to repair in their
Mhm.
own community.
Mhm.
But that is why I chose it, because the contemplative approach is the most powerful.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
with psychedelic medicine. So yeah, it was very disappointing. And there was a lot of conflict, I think, in our cohort. There are groups, breakout groups for people of color only.
Mhm.
Um, and that, of course, is questionable
Mhm. Mhm.
for many reasons. Um, and I was asked to give a presentation towards the end of the year about having a business and how to establish ketamine into your practice as a therapist. And I suspected I might get some interesting questions that would be from sort of the woke angle. I couldn't predict what they would be, but definitely, I think I was viewed as a capitalist because I talked about integrating it into business. And I
Mhm.
think that was definitely looked at warily in this
Mhm.
community, because capitalism is bad
But it makes
from
me
that.
wonder what were they going to do with their education?
Well, it's interesting because most of them have said they want to start nonprofits.
Oh, okay.
And,
Okay.
which is a very, I think, romanticized concept. It's a
Mhm.
business. You still have to run a business,
Right.
nonprofit.
Yeah.
So with way more accountability.
Yeah.
Um, so I had a woman who was a leader of the people of color in the sort of small group in our organization. And she asked me, um, okay, so say I want to have ketamine in my practice as a therapist. In your practice, how do you have indigenous sourced ketamine?
Mm.
And I was just like, do you know what ketamine is? It's a synthesized compound,
It's a
and
pharmaceutical product,
it's a
isn't it?
pharmaceutical,
Yeah.
it's an anesthetic. And I think, I've been trying to figure out what did she want me to say?
Hmm.
Like
Hmm.
from the most woke response. What was the most woke response I could give? And I think what she wanted me to say was, I won't work with any pharmacy unless they are indigenously owned and operated. And
Oh.
until then, I won't order ketamine.
So even in the marketplace, it wasn't about like this is
Yeah,
some natural product that we're harvesting
yeah,
somewhere, but even down to the
yeah,
marketplace,
yeah.
you want the people you do business with to have certain oppression markers that you can make
Yes.
sure you're sourcing through them.
Because in this psychedelic perspective, there are many organizations that are very inflamed and upset about the indigenous cultures historically being co-opted by the white pharmaceutical companies that come in.
Mhm, mhm.
And there are lots of stories about
It's
the
cultural
breakdown.
appropriation
Yeah,
and
yeah.
yeah. Mhm,
Which, I can see definitely we need to keep in mind ancient traditions. And I value that. But why not also keep in mind the Oracle of Delphi and the Western Greek tradition of altered states?
mm,
It just feels like there's this bias towards um, indigenous traditions that are non-white. We
mhm,
have many indigenous traditions that are Celtic.
mhm,
Amanita muscaria mushrooms have been used
mhm,
by druids throughout the centuries, but somehow that medical model, right,
mhm,
that came from an indigenous tradition, the Greek tradition,
mhm.
is not valued as much as the indigenous model. And somehow we're seen as irredeemably bad if we want to be within the medical model and
Mhm,
not
mhm,
bring in our ancestors. And we had to write papers on how I would dismantle my white supremacy and look at my internalized racism when I was in my session with my client as they're in their altered state. How would I connect with my ancestors? It was challenging, and I tried to be honest. I said, I don't have a relationship to this in the same way as the program does. I don't
Mhm.
believe I'm racist.
Mhm.
I'm surprised I graduated, actually. I don't know
Yeah.
if they actually read my papers.
Well, and I'm kind of just thinking back to your initial response to the professor in your
Mhm.
somatic therapies class, and I I think what you said was you felt like you hadn't really been exposed to this stuff very much.
Yeah.
Like you, maybe some people had a grounding in this that you were missing. And I had that exact same feeling because for me it was similar. I was going back to school after a long time out of the
Yeah.
academic um,
Mhm.
world. And so it was all kind of shocking. And I had the sense that I must have missed something. It's like
Yeah.
I missed like a
Yeah.
week of orientation here
Right.
where now we talk about things this way because
Yeah.
I don't know what we're talking about. But your
Yeah.
boldness in just saying, why would you tell me these things? I think that's pretty amazing, actually. Like there's an authenticity to that instead of,
Mm,
you know, quietly going along with it to
yeah.
challenge that like that is that's pretty gutsy and it sounds like she was kind of a deer in the headlights when
I
you did
think she
that.
was. Yeah. And I don't think of myself as brave. I am just, if I don't understand something, I'm going to be persistent and ask questions about it. And that may actually, that wasn't true in the Naropa program. I was quiet. I
Mhm, mhm,
because this is so important to me. I felt like I had to sacrifice my truth in order to have the certificate because I want to be able to offer this medication assisted therapy. I think it's really valuable, and we have the opportunity to actually heal things versus treat
mhm,
symptoms. So
mhm,
it was like that passion had to outweigh my passion for truth in that
mhm.
moment.
It was worth it to you just to buckle down and get it done. And
Yeah,
and
yeah,
it shouldn't be an act of bravery to say, "I'm not racist." That
yeah,
should not that
right,
shouldn't be an act of bravery,
right,
but right
right.
now, I think that there are
Yeah,
people out there
yeah,
who would find that to be incredibly brave considering whatever situation they're in. When you're being told that you don't know your own mind
yes,
and that somebody else knows better than you the
yes,
content of your own character,
yes,
to say, "No, I do know
yeah,
myself," is
yeah.
it's a big statement.
Which is so fascinating to me. I really like the way you put that because um, that is the thing that gets me activated is feeling gaslit
Mhm,
by culture. And
mhm.
I know that's a big TikTok word right now, but truly for those of us who have studied
It's a very helpful
narcissism,
concept.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. It gets me. I do not feel good about being gaslit and my ire goes up. And also ironically, I'm someone who has been very open since I was a dancer before I was a counselor. I've been in ballet classes since I was 4 years old and surrounded by gay culture
Mhm,
and embracing, all kinds of alternative ideas through the arts world. I went to arts college, I danced in companies, and it is very alternative. So I'm really someone who loves to embrace new ideas. So to me, it's ironic, like looking objectively, um, you'd think if someone was saying you are this, I would
mhm,
take it in and say, am I this? Um, but if it's so off, like you are racist, then I'm kind of glad I'm not
mhm.
too open, that I still have that. Maybe it's because I'm 51. I have a sense of strong enough character now where I can
Yeah.
say, actually, I am not racist. That is not me at all.
Mhm,
I
mhm.
do know my character.
No, I think that's such a that's it's a great, laying out the scene for yourself
Mm,
there. I mean, it really lays it out very well. I think I have similar sense of myself as being very open to a lot
mhm,
of things, and so when I'm told something like that, I do take it in and ask,
mhm.
"Is this true?"
Yeah.
But it seems like this ideology, the CSJ,
Mhm.
you come up against a wall. It's not openness.
Yeah.
It is the opposite. There's a very
Yeah.
closed
Yeah.
aspect to this that
Yeah.
um I think I found that pretty easy to reject after I
Yeah.
took it in and chewed
Yeah.
on it. Yeah.
Yeah, well, and the other thing is, I guess the hallmark of something that's truly transformative is
Mhm.
information that leads to change. And when I received I'm racist, there is no offer to then shift that into a healing stance. And that
Mhm.
is the crux of what is so damaging about CSJ, CRT, all of that ideology,
Mhm.
is that we are irredeemable because of our most reductionist factors, which is absurd
Mhm.
because we are nuanced, we are multivariate, we are creative, we're changeable, we're malleable. Thank goodness,
Mhm.
you know.
Mhm. Yeah,
Oh,
that's and that irredeemability,
yeah,
like in the case of CRT and whiteness, that's one of
yeah,
the big ones that's
yeah.
just the loudest call really right now. Um,
Mhm.
there's not a point at which you can come into a new class and be
Yeah,
like, "No, I'm one of the good ones. I
yeah,
already went
right.
through this training. I know I did
Yeah,
this. I'm cleansed." You're just continually put into the process. It's just back
yeah.
into the meat grinder with you. You are
Mm,
still white. You still have so much whiteness. You still got to
yeah.
do, and it's for the rest of your life.
I have a great story around the tragedy of this, and it
Mm.
goes back to my business. Um, after to sort of set the scene, so I hired 10 new therapists in 2020, 2021, and I started noticing that the flavor of therapists had changed. They're just graduated, just out of
Mhm.
school, and working towards their licensure. And we were going to supervise them and give them clients in this private practice setting, which is kind of rare. Usually you head into
It's
community
yeah,
mental
really
health.
nice. That sounds
Yeah.
like a dream.
Yeah, well, that's what I wanted to create. Is
Mhm.
it what I call it an apprenticeship program? Is
Mhm.
we see low to moderate acuity clients, you get free supervision, and you're really learning the outpatient private practice model, and you're not introducing yourself to burnout, which
Mm.
has been really a problem in our field the past few years. Clinicians are go into mental health, to community mental health, and then quit because
Mhm.
they
Mhm.
see such high acuity
Mhm.
clients. So I felt really strongly this would be really helpful to add to our profession and have this ability. So I hired 10 people, and in our interviews, they would put me on the spot and say, I had this over and over. What are you doing to create a DEI, diverse, equal, and inclusive environment as an employer?
Wow, that must have been something they were coached to ask.
Yeah. And after the third time it happened, I thought, okay, this is coming from school.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
because I was still very naive and not understanding
Mm.
the big picture. Um, and the only thing I could think of to say is that I've never not hired someone because of the color of their skin, and I hire on merit.
Mhm.
And I don't know if that was a satisfactory answer.
Mm.
But some of them joined us, and then it was a real challenge to have them as employees. But so that's the backdrop.
And
And
by
then
them, you mean the DEI focused students that were coming?
yes,
Okay.
yes,
Mhm.
it was. I'm going to get back to that. I really want to tell you the story about the
Okay.
tragedy of whiteness because I think
Yeah.
you'll really resonate with it. So I had another admin recently, a receptionist, who and I witnessed this. So she was verbally accosted by a therapist of ours, and the therapist raised her voice, raised her arms in the air, said some sort of sarcastic things about the receptionist. And the receptionist was really stunned and said, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. And the therapist was African American, and the receptionist was white.
Okay.
And the receptionist just had a meltdown.
Mm.
And she went back into my office and just cried and cried and cried. And I said, I'm really sorry. That was really unprofessional of the therapist to do. They were abusing their position of power. That was inappropriate. I'll go talk to them. And she said, no, no, no. I feel so bad that my whiteness made the therapist raise her voice at me because I was oppressing her.
What?
And I was like, oh no, no,
Wow.
no, honey, you're so confused. Like, no,
Wow.
this is not your whiteness. This is a professional who is acting unprofessionally and should have treated you better,
And
whatever color anybody was.
am I right in thinking that this wasn't the content of their disagreement, or
No,
was
it was
this?
about scheduling.
Oh gosh,
Yeah. So this is what I'm seeing,
that
I
sounds
think.
like domestic abuse. I mean, it sounds like a chronically
Mm,
domestically abused person.
it's really interesting, isn't it? Because they turn it on themselves. But it's this white fragility thing, the guilt, white guilt thing, that she had taken it so to heart, that she couldn't allow herself to see clearly when someone was treating her poorly. And I think, my God, the 20 somethings must be so confused and tangled up right now. No wonder there's so much anxiety.
Wow, that is incredible.
Yeah.
What an incredible way to twist that
Yeah.
encounter
And
and
she
to blame the self for that.
blamed the self, and she was grateful. She said, oh, like it hadn't dawned on her that it could
That
possibly
there was another way
be.
to look at it.
Well, and of course, like if you are in this, and this person was non-binary, and so very much in the gender ideology, and I just heard her say the week before that she had canceled J.K. Rowling, and I was like,
This is the receptionist.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah.
So she's very bought into the ideology of victimhood. And so it must be so confusing when the victim is the oppressor. It's like the brain just
Can't
unwires.
even. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Wow. Wow.
yeah. And so that is kind of the theme of what happened. That's why I contacted you and said, I think our counseling business was canceled, because we had such an upsurge of this attitude from employees, where somehow we had always been employers that, like, we were close to our employees. They were so grateful that we kept their jobs during the pandemic. We work really hard. And suddenly we had this group of employees that just seemed to hate us, and we could not figure out why. We weren't doing anything differently. We pay better than anyone in the area. We give PTO, but they were so angry with us, and you just feel it when you walk in the room. And they would push back when we would say their client had to pay a no-show fee for not showing. And they would email me and say, I need to advocate for my client. And I would say, against what? Like, King Health that's our business, is not anything to be advocated against. We're here for the client. And so I started to see this real projection from employees. And I think it is to fulfill that oppressor oppressed thing that they had been studying, some of them from Antioch, for those years, where they just could not see an employer as, at the very least, a neutral party. We had to be the oppressor. We had a clinician tell us she was very upset. She had to buy her clients big sunglasses because she had to protect them from being seen in the waiting room.
I don't even understand.
Leslie, this is how I felt for the past. I mean, maybe you can understand my utter confusion.
Oh,
like,
yeah.
how can you possibly believe that is useful or helpful?
No, I mean, it's bizarre. It's and this kind of, it goes full circle to that experience that you had with the counselor who walked in and yelled at your staff about her client who was your staff member.
Yeah.
And what I thought when you described that, I thought of the way that I sat as a graduate student, so perplexed, hearing that my number one job as a counselor was going to be an advocate and an activist. And I'm going to have to advocate for my clients. And I'm thinking, well, I guess that sounds like she advocated. I'm thinking in terms of, I remember being told this and sitting there thinking, well, how do I picture a counselor advocating for someone? And I thought, well, I mean, I could help them find resources, we could search together, we could, but me then taking on the role of, like, making phone calls for them or showing up or driving them somewhere or whatever. This sounds like, I don't know, is that some kind of a social work case manager person, but that doesn't sound like a counselor to me.
Yeah, and I think that is the difference of maybe being classically trained, even though I wasn't necessarily classically trained, but trained in 2003 versus trained in 2015 when CSJ and all of that hit academia, is that I believe what they're advocating for is their client's victimhood. They're not
Yeah.
advocating for any sense of resilience, like you're saying, anti-resilience.
Mhm.
It's deepening the victimhood culture in every facet.
Yeah,
How
it's
I
making
couldn't
people dependent. I mean, it's basically
yes,
caretaking and
yes,
inviting them into a relationship where they're going to have,
yeah,
um, they're just it's an invitation to, as you say, victimhood
yeah,
and
yeah.
dependency, really.
Well, and if you can imagine, like we ended up, so one of my specialties is a stepmother support. And
Mm,
because of my own experience and my history of co-parenting with a very difficult bio mom,
mm,
my husband's ex. Um, so this is a great analogy, I think, is that she was very indulgent with the kids in the sense of our daughter was very nervous about riding the school bus.
mm,
So on the days that we had her, we would have her ride the school bus so
mm,
she could learn to face that fear, learn that she would, overcome it and have this confidence and then be more independent.
mm,
Her mom would secretly pick her up at the bus stop and take her to school because she was too sensitive and fragile. Now, this is
mm,
a 7-minute bus ride. It's not like
mhm,
an hour and a half,
mhm, mhm,
And so it's that the undermining, and so it made us look like, from Elisa's perspective, and if she's watching this, she would agree with me. We've talked about this since, is it made us look like really mean parents.
mm,
And so this happened with our counselors over and over, where they would ally against King Health with their client.
mm,
Like,
mm,
um, King Health should provide a secret tunnel out to the parking lot so you don't have to see anyone. Isn't that terrible? I'm going to have to provide you sunglasses. And so King Health ends up looking like a terrible um, employer or mental health organization because we won't value the client's privacy. So they would set up the dynamic with their client against
mm,
the very business that is providing the counseling for them.
mhm, mhm,
And we kept running into that over and over and over in different ways.
mhm. It sounds like creating ways to mm, instill new insecurities and new problems.
Yeah, yeah,
Mhm.
yeah.
And when you're trained that way, I
Mhm.
can see why you would. I mean,
Yeah,
that is the social justice therapy training,
yeah.
is to be looking for those problems and
I
then
wish I
creating sensitivities.
I wish I had understood that. Instead,
Mhm,
I just felt attacked and bad about myself
mhm,
and thought, am I such a terrible manager? Like, have we and I just felt really frustrated. And
mhm,
I think I've needed some distance from it to understand, oh, it really is how they were educated. And I don't know how they will be unindoctrinated
mhm.
from that. And the
That
poor clients,
mhm,
they're poor clients.
mhm, not being served well.
No.
It it makes me wonder, as an employer, is there a way to screen, especially as an employer of counselors, is there a way to screen prospective employees for ideology?
Oh my gosh, Leslie, it's so complex because, as you know, the ACA Code of Ethics
Yeah.
says we have to do affirming care, right? So the reason I jumped to gender is that they are so enmeshed. People that I think have believed the gender ideology are also very critical social justice based. So it's
Yeah.
like a triumvirate.
You mentioned this earlier when you were talking about the particular therapist that
Yeah,
barged in, and you
yeah,
said that there's a philosophical stance
yeah,
there that seems similar,
yeah,
and I've been wanting to ask you more about that.
yeah.
And so, yeah, I'm curious what your thoughts are about that.
Oh, ask me that again, will you? Like the
So you said
stance of,
you mentioned, so
mm,
this particular therapist uses alternative pronouns and
oh, yeah,
specializes in this
yeah,
kind of like alternative gender
yeah,
support
yeah.
work. And so there's a philosophical stance there,
Yeah,
and
I
I've
see.
been curious to get back to that. And
Yeah,
is it this enmeshment that you're talking about? Is this part of that?
yeah, I think it's yes. And I think the extreme of that is absolute affirming care
Okay.
versus questioning care.
Okay.
If that clinician had been able to unenmesh, they would have then questioned, how do you deal with that overwhelm at your job and other
Mhm.
areas of your life? Where else are you successfully working with that? Maybe we could help you embody that there.
Mhm.
That has a distance from the problem,
Mhm.
and implies that the client is wise enough to have resource and resilience to figure it out, and you help
Mhm.
them do that.
Mhm.
And that is, I think, what is lacking. Like, I had a therapist I interviewed a couple weeks ago for a position. Seemed like, and I have to say, I can't be ageist, but I have noticed that the people that I feel more philosophically aligned with that I'm interviewing are over 40,
Mhm. Mhm.
generally.
Mhm.
They have had a different education.
Mhm.
They were
Mhm.
educated before CRT and CSJ.
Mhm.
And so this person was in her 50s, and we were talking. And before she left, and I'm so glad she said this, she said, "My favorite clients to work with are children getting ready for therapy, for surgery. Sorry.
For
Children getting
surgery.
ready for therapy would be great.
Yes, that
Children
would
getting ready,
children
yeah, getting ready
children
for
getting ready for
surgery."
surgery as in gender
Yeah,
surgeries.
yeah.
Wow.
And so that is the extreme, I think, of not asking questions.
So you had gone through an entire interview thinking this is
Yeah,
lovely. I think this
yeah,
person seems like a good fit. And then it was some offhand thing that she decided to throw
yeah,
in that
yeah,
that revealed this major
yeah,
red flag that says, I believe in
yeah,
this ideological
yeah. Which
therapeutic perspective.
I can't ethically stand by and say, okay,
Mm.
because I don't believe it's ethical to allow children to cut off body parts and
Mhm.
prevent puberty and all of the damage that creates.
Mhm.
Um, and so you asked, how do you screen for it? And I don't know. I don't know how to legally screen for it.
Mhm.
I can't ask. Um,
Yeah, and especially if you're as you're pointing out, it's right there in the code of ethics. It's the
yeah,
whole industry is becoming
yeah.
really captured. What do you see as the future for this? Do you see a future for yourself in licensed work or in and
Depends on
maybe
how
that's a
people
huge
respond to this
question.
interview.
Yeah. I mean, I keep thinking that we need some kind of parallel profession to spring up
Yeah,
because there are so
yeah,
many really wonderful,
yeah,
brilliant people who have so much to offer who are
yeah,
are opposed to what's happening right now. And if we
yeah,
can't take back the profession
yeah,
that we've had, then what do we do moving forward to distinguish that this is not this? These two things are not alike.
yeah. Yeah, I remember talking about this with you in one of the solid ground groups, and I am
Mhm.
intrigued by that idea. And I think that it probably will be the coaching certification as long as it's not captured eventually. Um, but I don't think the medical model will release this ideology anytime soon.
Mhm.
Um, you
It
know, I,
fits too neatly.
it fits too neatly, and there's too much money involved, unfortunately.
Mhm.
And I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but I do believe in follow the money. And I'm very interested in Jennifer Bilek's work, the investigative reporter who talks about Martine Rothblatt and the Pritchken family, Pritchker, I can't remember their
I
names,
don't
but
know this. I would love to
oh,
read up on this though.
I think it's
Um,
really important that you do. So I think you'd enjoy it. Martine Rothblatt is absolute obsessed with transhumanism, is a
hmm,
trans woman. If,
okay.
or as I'm trying to really train myself to say, a person with gender dysphoria,
Okay.
because I think when we say trans, we're really uh, sort of, for me, it feels like I'm agreeing that it exists. And
Hmm.
I think that
Hmm.
what really exists is gender dysphoria.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
trying to get
Hmm.
better about saying it that way.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've been thinking that just as the gender ideologues will say
Yeah.
that gender is a social construct.
Mm.
I think it's very important to be clear that transgender is a medical construct.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
we
Yeah.
do have people dealing with strong feelings and
Mhm.
dysphoria, and that's
Mhm.
real.
Yeah.
And it's just how's that best addressed? And that's the
Right.
question that's been
Yeah.
asked and answered by the medical
Yeah.
industry and by the gender ideologues in a certain
Yeah.
way without exploration of other options.
I've been really curious about, my husband and I were talking last night or yesterday, and we were saying, where did this idea of gender begin? Like, has there ever been a time in our lives, did it shift from just being a sex to having a gender? And we sort of did a little research, and John Money in 1945 proposed this theory that somehow a gender could be recognized separately than a sex.
Hmm.
And he is the sex researcher that really influenced Albert Kinney. Is that his name?
Kinsey?
Kinsey.
Yeah.
And so I thought that was so interesting that it was 1945.
Hmm. Isn't he the one who did the surgery or the transition of the little boy who
Yes.
had the terrible botched circumcision?
Yes.
Oh, that's a terrible story.
It's a horrible story.
So this is where this concept originated, is with him in 1945.
And of course, I'm not a total specialist, but this is just what I discovered and looking back and reading about gender.
Mm.
And because it's such a fascinating idea, like, Helen Joyce talks about, really the gender ideology is the idea of the spirit that floats around and inhabits our bodies and tells us if we're male or female or at any point. And I thought the way she described that was so illustrative of how bizarre when you think about that we are suddenly divorced from our sex.
That's
So,
really interesting. I like the
yeah.
imagery of that. It's
Yeah.
fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it sounds kind of metaphysical and I going back to the work that you do with psychedelic assisted therapy,
Yeah.
it's very transpersonal and again, it's so interesting to me that this open-minded population, this open-minded group would be so captured by something so closed.
Yeah.
And it's a shame that you're finding that to be the case in this niche that you've really carved out for yourself.
Yeah.
And I hope that there's a way forward for what you're doing that people can avail themselves of without the ideological strings attached, and that you're able to move into, so that you're able to move through this and not be so burdened by all these pressures.
Thank you. I would love to just actually study consciousness and talk with other therapists about the work without having to talk about the whole power ideologies and invisible systems of racism within the work that we do. It's not as interesting to me as the actual clinical work. And, talk about interesting metaphysical transformation. Psychedelics can provide a feeling of oneness with God, with the universe. And I would love to be able to help people transcend their pain and have that experience.
Well, I think that's beautiful. And do you have any, as we kind of draw to a close, do you have any recommendations for people for if they're curious about that topic, where they should go, and recommendations also for your work or links that you'd like to share?
Yeah, well, I am the psychedelic counselor on Instagram. And I'm KarenCking.com on my website. How to Change Your Mind by Michael Pollan was really the cultural opening, zeitgeist, groundbreaking book. And I just highly recommend it because it's a history of psychedelics, but told from a very personal perspective as he goes through his own journey. I think that's really a great place to start. And you learn so much about the work itself. Google Scholar is a great place to look at all of the research that's happening. There have been a paper that compared a psilocybin versus an antidepressant. So there's starting to be real comparative studies now coming out. So that's always a great place. There's so much research happening now.
Yeah, that's great. And I loved that book also. I thought it was fantastic. So I recommend that as well.
Great.
And yeah, thank you so much for speaking with me, Karen, and for sharing your experiences with all of this. I'll really be looking forward to seeing how the story keeps unfolding for you.
Thank you. Thanks for your great questions. And I really am, if you meet any other psychedelic counselors that are anti-woke, let me know. I can't find anyone.
Well, I hope some of them will watch this video and reach out to you. Awesome. Well, thank you again, Karen.
Thank you so much.